My son's wife gave her affair partner a $23,000 Rolex at his birthday dinner. A dinner she told my son was a mandatory team event. My son Caleb's gift that same weekend for their 8th wedding anniversary, a drugstore card she'd clearly grabbed at the last minute, still creased from being folded wrong into the envelope. I know because I was there when he opened it. I watched his face. He smiled anyway. He always smiled anyway. I'm 64 years old. I've been around long enough to know that some things you don't fix by talking. Some things you fix by waiting. This is the story of how I waited. Caleb was 37 when all of this started unraveling. Though I think, if I'm being honest with myself, it started unraveling a long time before that. Maybe even before the wedding. But fathers don't always let themselves see what they don't want to see. My son is a good man. That sounds like something every father says, and maybe it is, but I mean it the way a man means something after he's had 60 years to understand the difference between good and easy. Caleb is not easy. He's quiet, methodical, the kind of person who reads the instruction manual before assembling something, who keeps receipts organized in a folder, who calls on birthdays 2 days early because he's afraid he'll forget if he waits until the actual day. He's not flashy. He never was. His wife, her name is Renata Voss, and I'll use her full name because she's earned that, was the opposite of him in every visible way. Loud where he was quiet, impulsive where he planned. She wore that contrast like it was a personality. We balance each other out, she used to say, laughing, and for years I believed it was true. For years it looked like it might be. They met at a conference in Austin. Caleb was doing project management for a mid-size construction firm. Renata was in commercial real estate, already building a name for herself, already moving fast. She was 31 when they met, he was 30. She pursued him, which surprised me when he told me. Not because I didn't think my son was worth pursuing, but because Renata didn't strike me as someone who chased anything slowly. She moved in the way of people who are used to getting what they want, before they've finished deciding they want it. They were happy, I think, for the first few years. Or at least they performed happiness convincingly. They bought a house in Scottsdale. 4 bedrooms, a pool, the kind of neighborhood with HOA rules about what color you're allowed to paint your shutters. Caleb kept the books for the mortgage. Renata made most of the income. That was the arrangement, and nobody said it out loud, but it was always there, quietly shaping things. Renata's career took off the way careers do when someone is talented and ruthless in equal measure. She became a regional director for a commercial real estate development group. There were trips, there were dinners, there were late nights that stretched into early mornings. Caleb covered the house. He picked up the dry cleaning, managed the contractors when the kitchen was redone, attended her firm's holiday parties, and stood slightly behind her in every photograph. I visited twice a year. I watched. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make it sound like I suspected something was wrong and said nothing. The truth is messier than that. I noticed things, small things, the kind of things you file away and tell yourself mean nothing. The way she'd laugh differently on certain phone calls and then go to another room. The way Caleb sometimes looked at the middle distance when she was telling a story about work, not distracted exactly, more like bracing. The way she stopped asking my son his opinion on things and started announcing decisions that were already made, I noticed. I said nothing. He was happy enough. Or he seemed to be. And it wasn't my marriage. Then came the dinner. Caleb called me on a Tuesday night in March about 16 months ago. He wasn't crying. Caleb doesn't cry easily. But there was something in his voice that I recognized. I had heard it once before, when he was 9 years old and came home from school and told me a kid had hit him, and he had just stood there and let it happen because he didn't know what else to do. That particular kind of flat bewilderment. He said he'd been going through some paperwork. Joint credit card statements because he was doing their taxes. He said he'd found a charge he didn't recognize. A reservation for a private dining room at a restaurant in Scottsdale he'd never been to. $1,200. On a night Renata had told him she was at a regional manager's meeting in Phoenix. He'd pulled up the charges going back 14 months. He listed them to me like he was reading from a spreadsheet, which knowing Caleb, he probably was. Hotel stays in cities where she'd said she was alone for work. 2 sets of flights on dates where her company had only booked one. A jewelry purchase for $4,400 that she had told him was a client gift. And then, most recently, an order receipt he'd found in her car. A receipt for a custom-engraved Rolex, $23,000, paid for with money from their joint savings account, charged to a card he'd known she had but hadn't looked at closely in years. He said, "Dad, I need to know if I'm reading this wrong." I told him he wasn't reading it wrong. There was a long pause on the phone. He said, "Okay, just that." Okay, we talked for almost 3 hours that night, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, he told me who the Rolex had been engraved for. The invoice listed a name, Marcus Delaney. Marcus Delaney was the VP of acquisitions at Renata's firm. A man Caleb had met at no fewer than 6 work events. A man who had shaken my son's hand and looked him in the eye. A man who Renata had described more than once as just a colleague. Honestly, he's a little much. Caleb found a photo on her phone that night. He'd never gone through her phone before. He said it made him feel sick going through it, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he is. He found about 4 months' worth of messages. Some of them were practical. Some of them were not. He didn't read them to me and I didn't ask him to. What he did read me was one message from Marcus Delaney sent 6 weeks earlier. I know you're not happy there. We both know it's been over for a long time. Stop pretending. My son had been living in a house with a woman who had been telling another man that her marriage was already over. I want to pause here, because this is the part I've thought about the most in the last year. Not the betrayal. I understand betrayal, in the abstract, in the way that anyone who's lived long enough understands it. What I've thought about is the specific cruelty of that message. We both know it's been over for a long time. She had never said that to Caleb. She had let him believe something was real while quietly narrating its ending to someone else. And that, to me, is not just unfaithfulness. That is a particular kind of meanness. Caleb didn't confront her that night. I told him not to. I know that might sound cold. It might sound like a father telling his son to swallow something he shouldn't have to swallow. That's not what I meant. What I meant was, not yet. Not until you know what you have, and what it's worth, and what you want the ending to look like. You only get to decide once. Don't waste the moment on anger. He agreed. He went to bed in the guest room that night and told Renata he had a headache. She did not ask how he was feeling. We made a plan. Over the next 6 weeks, the Caleb quietly gathered everything. He downloaded statements. He photographed documents. He kept a log, date, and amount for every charge he could identify as being associated with the affair. And there were more than he'd initially found. Renata had been funding this relationship with their shared money for at least 18 months. Hotel rooms, meals, weekends away while Caleb believed she was at industry conferences. Even a trip to Sedona that she had described to him as a leadership retreat. Total, across 18 months, somewhere close to $31,000. Caleb called a family law attorney. I helped him pay the consultation fee. The attorney's name was Patricia, and she was the kind of person you want in your corner. Calm, precise, not theatrical about any of it. She told him what mattered and what didn't. She told him Arizona is a community property state, which meant the money Renata had spent on the affair was a factor. She told him to stop contributing to the joint savings and to open a separate account, quietly, immediately. He did. She also told him something I've thought about a lot since. Document the lifestyle he's been supporting. Not just what she spent, what he contributed. Because Caleb had spent 8 years covering the house while Renata built her career. He'd managed their property. He'd handled the logistics of their life. He'd given up a promotion opportunity in Denver 3 years into the marriage. Because Renata's career required them to stay in Scottsdale. Those things have value. You just have to be willing to say so. Renata had no idea any of this was happening. She continued coming home, continued having dinner with my son, continued sleeping in their bed, continued referencing future plans. A trip they were going to take to Portugal, a renovation she wanted to do to the back patio. As if the future she was describing was the one she was actually planning to live. I don't know how people do that. I genuinely don't understand the interior life of a person who can sit across from someone they've deceived and talk about patio renovations. I came to visit in month 2 of the plan. Caleb asked me to, partly for moral support, partly because he needed someone else to know the full picture. Renata greeted me warmly, poured me a glass of wine, asked about my health. She was charming in the way she'd always been charming. Polished, attentive in bursts, the kind of person who gives you their full attention for exactly as long as is required. Over dinner she mentioned Marcus Delaney by name. She said he was absolutely killing it in acquisitions this quarter. She said it looking directly at me, smiling. I smiled back. I have been alive 64 years. I know how to smile. There was one night about 2 months before the end that I keep coming back to. Caleb called me after Renata had left for what she said was a work dinner. He called me from the backyard standing by the pool and he said, "Dad, I don't know if I can keep doing this." And I understood what he meant. It wasn't weakness. It's genuinely hard to sit in a house that's become a performance, to have conversations that are hollow in the middle, to watch someone you loved act like everything is fine when you know. You have seen the receipts, literally. You have the PDFs, that it is not. I said, "Caleb, what do you want the ending to look like?" He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I want her to understand what she actually did, not just to me, what she actually did." And I told him, "Then you have to wait a little longer. Because right now she doesn't understand anything. Right now she thinks everything is going fine." He waited. The plan had a timeline. Patricia had been drafting. Caleb had been building a record, and there was one piece we had put in place quietly, 3 months before the end. I had reached out to Marcus Delaney's wife. I want to be honest about this. I went back and forth on it. It is not a small thing to contact someone and deliver information that will break something in their life. But I thought about what that text message had said. We both know it's been over for a long time. Marcus Delaney had been sitting across the table from my son at firm events, had shaken his hand, and had been sending messages to my son's wife about how her marriage was essentially already dead. His wife deserved to know. She had a right to make her own decisions with the actual information. I sent her a letter, a real letter, on paper, mailed to their home. I did not put a return address. I included copies of 3 of the credit card charges that could be cross-referenced with hotel records in Phoenix. I did not include the personal messages. I thought she deserved facts, not intimacy. I don't know exactly what she did with that letter. What I know is that roughly 6 weeks later, Marcus Delaney was no longer employed at Renata's firm. The day Caleb served Renata with divorce papers was a Thursday. Patricia had arranged it precisely, a process server at 9 a.m. at the house, while Caleb was already at his attorney's office. He told me later that he'd made coffee that morning before he left it in the pot the way he always did, and then stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at the house. The kitchen Renata had redesigned, the countertops they'd argued about, the window above the sink that looked out over the backyard and the pool, and he'd felt, he said, something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite relief, something quieter than both. He left. The process server arrived 40 minutes later. Renata called him 12 times in the next 3 hours. He didn't answer. He called me instead, and we talked until his attorney walked in to get started. Here's what the divorce filing included, because I think this matters. It included documentation of $31,400 in marital funds spent on the extramarital relationship over 18 months. It included the log Caleb had maintained, date and amount, every charge he could identify. It included an accounting of the contributions he had made to the household and to her career, the years he'd managed the property, the promotion he'd declined, the way their division of labor had consistently prioritized her professional advancement over his. Patricia had been clear about this strategy. In Arizona, when one spouse has dissipated marital assets, it affects the distribution. Those $31,400 mattered. The Rolex mattered. Every hotel receipt mattered. It also included a claim on the equity in the house that Caleb's attorney believed was favorable given his contributions. Renata made significantly more money, but Caleb had given 8 years to the maintenance of everything that had let her make that money. Patricia put a number on that. It was a significant number. Renata hired a lawyer. She contested. There were months of back and forth, things I only know about secondhand, because Caleb stayed measured about what he shared with me, and I tried to follow his lead. What I can tell you is that Marcus Delaney's absence from her professional life was not a small thing for Renata. Her position within the firm had been tied, in ways she'd perhaps not fully examined, to the relationship with someone who was no longer there. There was a reorganization. Renata was moved to a different division. Her title changed. The income she had based her lifestyle on became less stable. Meanwhile, the house they owned together was effectively frozen until the settlement. Marcus Delaney's wife had filed for divorce within 2 months of that letter. His professional reputation at the firm had collapsed. His marriage was ending. I do not take pleasure in other people's pain, but I also don't believe that a man who shook my son's hand and said what he said in those text messages has a claim on my sympathy. Some consequences are earned. I went back to Scottsdale for the final settlement signing. Caleb didn't need me there. He had Patricia. He had his own quiet competence. But he asked me to come anyway, and I came. We had dinner the night before at a barbecue place he likes near his apartment. The one he'd rented after moving out, which was spare, and a little dark but had good light in the mornings, he said. We didn't talk about the divorce much. We talked about his work. He'd taken a new role, senior project manager for a larger firm, the kind of position he would have moved to years earlier if things had been different. We talked about the trip he was thinking about taking. Ireland, maybe. Scotland. He'd always wanted to go. The settlement, when it was finalized, gave him significantly more than Renata had initially intended. The documentation of asset dissipation was decisive. He walked out with enough to buy a smaller house outright, money in a retirement account that had been recalculated fairly, and his name off a mortgage that had become a liability. Renata got the big house, and with it the payments that her restructured income was now going to struggle to cover. That was nobody's doing but her own. A few weeks after the settlement, Renata came to Caleb's apartment. He told me about it on the phone that same evening. She had not called ahead. She rang the buzzer and he answered, and he said he stood at the door and just looked at her for a moment. This woman he had spent 8 years with, and he felt nothing dramatic. Just a kind of tired clarity. She said she wanted to talk. He said there wasn't anything to talk about. She said she was sorry. He said okay. He said it the same way he'd said it on the phone that night a year and a half earlier when I'd told him he wasn't reading the statements wrong. Flat, final. Okay. He did not invite her in. He said goodbye. He closed the door. He texted me about 20 minutes later. Just she stopped by. I'm okay. Going to make dinner. He makes dinner now. He cooks for himself. He calls me on actual birthdays, not 2 days early. He sounds different on the phone. Not happier, exactly, not yet, but more like himself. Less like a man managing a performance. I think about that $23,000 Rolex sometimes. I think about Renata sitting across from my son at dinner knowing she'd spent their shared savings on a watch for another man. Telling Caleb about patio renovations. Looking him in the eye. I think about the specific mathematics of it. 8 years of a man's life offered genuinely, received carelessly, and discarded quietly while she made other plans. I'm 64. I've seen a lot of marriages. I've seen what people do to each other, and I've seen what they tell themselves about it afterward. What I've learned, what this past year and a half confirmed for me, is that the most important thing is not to move too fast when someone has wronged you badly. The anger is real. The anger is appropriate. But anger spends itself in the moment, and then it's gone. And what you're left with is whatever you built while the anger was burning. If you build well, quietly, carefully, with the right people around you, you walk away with something. If you don't, you just have the memory of a scene you caused. Caleb built well. He gave himself time and he built, and when the door closed, it closed on his terms. He's going to Ireland in the fall. He asked if I wanted to come along for part of it. I told him I'd think about it. I'm thinking yes.